This is about freedmen and freeing slaves, manumission, as the term is. There's no skinny for this because it's quite comprehensive, or there's a lot of detail in here, and it can't be summarized in a single slide, so you will have to make your own notes from this. Okay. A freedman, or freedwoman, was a slave who had been freed. The clue is in the name. The Latin name is libertus for a freedman, liberta for a freed woman. When a slave was freed, they achieved some status, but not full citizen status. They became plebeian citizens. In the Roman world, compared with ancient Greece, certainly ancient Athens, which is tends to be our focus and is our focus in this course. In Athens, freeing slaves was not a commonplace activity, but in Rome, by comparison, it was. In certain situations, slaves could save up and buy their freedom. A positive relationship with their master could lead to the master freeing them, either when they were alive or maybe in a will. And I think it's this pervasive sense that slaves were freed reasonably frequently, which meant that slaves perhaps saw this as a possibility. It was a motivation for them to behave as better slaves. For some reason, I'm reminded of the John Steinbeck quotation about how the majority of Americans don't consider themselves to be poor, they consider themselves to be temporarily inconvenienced millionaires. And perhaps there's an edge of that to Roman attitudes to slavery. Maybe the slaves themselves thought, well, I might be a slave, but I'm not going to be like this forever. Certainly in the towns and in domestic slavery. We'll come on to this later. Some slaves, of course, would be freed simply because they were too old to do the job anymore. If you have a slave working in a workshop doing heavy work and they reach 60 or 70 years of age, the slave would be freed out of purely practical reasons. We might look at it in humane terms and think, well, that's the correct thing to do for a person who is not physically up to the task, but perhaps it comes from a more economic position or economic motivation. Freedmen in Rome would wear a felt hat called a pileus, and it marked them out. It's very, again, in my head, when I think about the visual, I think about the way that Jews were treated in 16th century Venice. If you've seen the film production of The Merchant of Venice, you'll see that you have these large bodies of people moving around Venice, and some of them are wearing red caps to indicate that they are Jews. And in my imagination, when I imagine ancient Rome, I imagine a huge chunk of the people wandering the streets, going around their daily business in Rome with this hat on, the pileus. And I don't think that's going to be too far from the truth of how it was. Augustus took measures in his time both to stabilize the number of slaves coming into Rome, but also to ensure that not too many slaves were freed, and to kind of keep the distinction between slave and freedman. Okay, manumission. It is also the job facing Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. That's a really bad joke that I use with a number of classes and it never lands. Nonetheless, now it's in this video forever. Manus is the Latin for hand, and mittere means to release or to send. So manumission literally means to release from the hand, like the hand is coming away. And a slave could be freed in an informal way or in a formal way. It depended on the owner and in the circumstances. Informal manumission wasn't legal during the Republic, but in the Imperial Age it was. the reason why a lot of people gravitated towards freeing slaves informally is that through the formal manumission of slaves, they would have to pay a 5%, it's 5% of the value of the slave as a tax. If you do it formally, if you informally release your slave, then you don't have to pay the 5%. So again, there's an economic motive behind the informal manumission. However, it is worth noting that informal manumission did not give freed slaves the same rights. You can have a look at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 5th bullet point, or the second lined point. Informal manumission gave fewer rights. Slaves freed informally did not become citizens, and any property or wealth they accumulated reverted to their former owners when they died. So that's, on the one hand you say 5%, on the other hand the freedman, the freed slave, no longer has the same rights. And of course the master could, because it's not been done formally, the master could change his mind and assert his right of control over a slave who believes himself to be freed. So Augustus introduces Latin rights to informally freed slaves, which gave them the possibility of becoming full citizens. And this actually increased the number of informally freed slaves. So how are you going to do it? You've got a slave, you want to manumit, you want to free your slave. There are 3 methods. Method number 1. Master writes down a letter saying, this slave belonged to me, is now free. Ta-da! Slave's free. Number 2, the master, and I like this because it's quite a symbolic act. At the dinner table with other guests around it, the master invites the slave to join the group. It's almost like an act of stating equality. You are of the same status to sit at the same table as we free people. It's symbolic, so it's the one that I always remember most easily. The third one is a simple declaration in front of witnesses, friends, where the master says, you are my slave, you are now freed. That's it. That's the end of the ceremony. So let's have a look at how you could do it in a more formal way. Right. Through the formal process, I'm just reading from the slide here, through the formal process, the slave becomes a libertus, but did not have full citizen rights. A libertus could vote, could marry, could engage in trade. Brilliant. But could not serve in the army, could not become a senator or knight and have advanced political positions in Rome, couldn't hold a magistracy. But their sons and their sons would have complete citizen rights, and their daughters would have the somewhat reduced female citizen rights. So how are you going to do it formally? You've got a slave, you want to release them, manumit them formally. The most common way of doing it was in a will. Document that says, when I die, this slave is going to be a freedman. That's it. Easily done. Manumission by the rod is kind of peculiar for the reasons you can read in front of you. The slave is taken with the by the master to the praetor, and the master, the slave, and third party, a friend or a witness. The witness lays a freedom rod, a stick essentially, called a vindicta, on the slave, pronouncing the slave free, and the master then follows suit by placing his or her vindicta on the slave. So there are 2 rods prodding into the slave now, the witness and the master saying, you are free. And the praetor witnesses this action. The praetor says, the slave is now free, and then the master slaps the slave. Yeah, it's a funny one, that. I actually had to look into this as to why, and there seems to be a little bit of dispute or uncertainty around the actual reason. It's a symbolic, a traditional gesture, the slap, but it is called the alapa. And the best source I came across, or rather the first source that came to hand, which seemed reasonable, suggested that it represented the final act of violence from a master towards the slave. And in that sense, again, it's, I like the symbolism, much as it's a peculiar one, to free somebody and slap them in the face. But on a symbolic level, to say that's it, that is the end of the violence you will suffer as a slave. It's kind of cool. Quite like that. Or you could take your slave to the census, and all the master had to do was ask that the slave's name be recorded in the census as a freed person. That's it. The state now recognizes the slave as a freedman. So once your slave is free, what are the options? Well, it's not like it's an end of the relationship. And certainly when we look into the clientela, the client-patron system in Rome, you'll see how freedmen actually could have a substantial obligation to the men who freed them. But in terms of the work that they can have after being a slave, obviously their skill set is going to determine a lot of that. A patron, usually the man who freed them, might actually set them up in a workshop. So if a slave is a very good shoemaker, the master might set them up in a shoemaker's shop, but then request a percentage of the profits. So the master still has a kind of a controlling influence there. Having said that, freedmen worked and had full lives. Rome is filled with businesses run by freedmen. Some freedmen earned lots and lots of money, so it's quite odd that in Rome you could end up with a freedman who has been very successful and becomes very rich, and you could also have somebody from the patrician class whose family has fallen on hard times and they are penniless. So financial status and social status could be wildly different and also counterintuitive. Some freedmen served in the imperial retinue. Those of you who've seen I, Claudius will remember Narcissus, who served under Claudius, and his investigations into Messalina, Claudius's wife, led to her massive infidelities being exposed. If we're to trust the sources, and indeed if we're to trust I, Claudius, which, by the way, if you haven't watched and you're doing classics, you are letting yourself down. But if we are to trust I, Claudius, it seems that Messalina was sleeping with pretty much everybody in Rome who wasn't Claudius, and from time to time, Claudius. Anyway, Narcissus, a freedman working in the emperor's retinue, exposed her infidelity, and she was executed. So this is a freedman who was influential in the execution of the emperor's wife. That's not nothing. That's power. Of course, that Narcissus, again, according to the sources and according to I, Claudius, also attempted to engage in a relationship with Agrippina and the mother of Nero. That didn't go well, and eventually Agrippina had Narcissus executed. Swings and roundabouts, really, isn't it? When you're a freedman in the royal household, in the imperial household, I should say. Freedmen could have religious positions. There are two on the slide here. The Wicomagistri, which was a position worshipping the goddess who protected Rome from fire. And I'm sure all of you know, you should know anyway, in the time of Nero, there was a devastating fire in Rome, a really, really extraordinarily damaging one. So, do we blame the goddess for that? Or do we blame the freedmen for not worshipping her? Well, we'll move on. And then the Severi Augustales. These were, again, religious positions, but they were like priests who organized the worship of Augustus, of the emperor. And it was their responsibility to make sure that the emperor was honored and also that games were held in his honor. Again, to us, I mean, coming from a reasonably secular society, these might seem like unimpressive positions, but in Rome, in a highly religious society, these positions they carried status. So to be a freedman allowed you opportunities that you could never have as a slave. As I say, there's no skinny, you're just going to have to go back through and have a read of these notes. I don't think there's too much for you to get your head around. Maybe a couple of pieces of vocabulary you'll need to highlight. Nonetheless, as usual, if you have any questions, come and see me in class.